Welcome to Closing the Growth Gap from May 17th, 2024. Closing the Growth Gap is where I share my insights on the most interesting articles on growth and marketing based on my experience assessing hundreds of B2B SaaS companies and helping companies drive millions in growth. We have a number of interesting topics to discuss today. First up, John James says the number one mistake small brands make is emulating big brands. And he shows a number of examples showing that big brands didn't grow in the beginning doing what they're doing today. And this is an important topic because there's so much advice over there about what brands should be doing. How do small brands understand what's good advice, what they should be following, and which things should be left to the bigger brands, things that are actually a mistake for smaller brands to follow. And so we'll discuss that. And then Peter Walker from Carta shares data showing that this is a tough time for startups. Startup failures are up significantly on a year-over-year basis. And the thing about it is it doesn't need to be this way. Going back to my point about bad advice, startups have been given bad advice about pursuing growth at all costs. This significantly drives up the cost of acquisition. And right now, all the data shows cost per acquisition, sales and marketing spend is just at unsustainable levels. But it doesn't need to be this way. There's a way to drive efficient growth. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, Rick Bradberry from Forrester raises a point that's too often missed in sales and marketing, which is people making buying decisions are still people. And so we can't force them down the funnel the way we want them to proceed. Instead, we should be supporting them in making their buying decisions. So a number of interesting topics.
Okay, let's take a look at this article from John James. Number one mistake I routinely see is immature brands emulating a mature company playbook. Here's evidence from the early days of Nike, Lego, Nintendo, and Microsoft. Memetics is a powerful force. We all want to emulate what someone bigger or more successful is doing. It's human nature, but it's often the wrong thing to do because you're in a completely different stage where different dynamics apply. And this is what I share quite frequently, is that you need to make sure when you're considering what you want to do next to drive growth, that what you're reading about, the advice you're getting is coming from a similar organization as you. Same, maybe it's the same category, same size. Because it's really easy for what's good advice for a larger organization to be bad advice for your company. I mean, the example I always like to use is A/B testing to see if you can drive incremental revenue. As I shared in a previous video, is that you can, if you're a certain size B2B SaaS company and you're trying to A/B test to incremental revenue, it could take you 60 years. Now, that's just bad advice. That's not something you should be pursuing. There's other ways to do A/B testing, and that's the good advice. But to follow someone on LinkedIn who says you have to be A/B testing for incremental revenue, that's not good. That's not what you should be following. That's not how you're going to drive growth. All right, so he moves on. Advertising people love to convince smaller companies they need to do more Nike-style, emotional, motivational brand advertising, when this activity came by accident to Nike, many decades after they established themselves via print ad. Same goes for Apple's famous Think Different campaign. They had an expensive spot book they had to use, but couldn't feature specific products because they were in the process of swapping out their entire product line. Hence a whimsical ad about thinking different that stitches together archival footage they had purchased the rights to use. And so, this is a great example. Everyone will use Nike and Apple as examples of what you should be doing. And there's great things you can learn from them. But to say this is how we're going to grow right now based on what Nike and Apple are doing today is probably not your path to growth. Heads of marketing love adding shiny new pieces of enterprise tech like a new CRM instead of focusing on getting the basics right. And so here's the important part here. And CMOs love media, brand redesigns, and creative content instead of spending more time with product, distribution, sales, and packaging. So use this. If you're a smaller brand, getting these things right, the product market fit right, your brand right, how you're selling right is really, really important. This is where you should be focused. And this really comes into who you hire to help support your marketing. If you have someone who wants to focus on some of these high-level things rather than focusing on these core areas that are really going to drive growth, then it's not going to be a good fit when you bring someone on from a marketing perspective. He goes on to say diagnosis is greater than strategy, is greater than tactics. And further down, he provides some really cool examples Like Nintendo goes all the way back to the 1800s and started doing something completely different than game systems, but ultimately they grew to where they are now. But the point of this post is that emulating brands where they are now it's a better opportunity to look at where they started from and see what they did to drive growth. And maybe there's opportunities to learn from that if you're a smaller brand. Okay, next up, this post from Peter Walker, who is head of insights at Carta. More startups using Carta closed down in Q1 than in any other quarter. 254 startups shut down in Q1 versus 161 in Q1 of 2023, 58% higher. So that's huge growth. I mean, that's huge increase in the number of failures. And they have some other key points. Shutdowns rose across the board, but the increase was higher for companies who had already raised a price round versus those that had yet to go into price equity fundraising. Shutdowns rose 133% for Series B companies over the past year. It's not just smaller companies closing up shop. And he goes on to say, he finishes this post by saying, hug your founder friends. So much respect for those trying to push forward through the muck. And this is, this is painful. This is, obviously not a good story from a startup perspective. But this ties back to what I was saying earlier about bad advice. Unfortunately, I think a lot of startups were given bad advice about how to grow their business. And they just invested too much. They didn't spend efficiently. I know we're sort of correcting on this, but the growth at all costs, just trying to pursue growth, pushed up customer acquisition costs to a level that's just not sustainable. I mean, I've shared posts in the past about where sales and marketing expense is compared to average ARR, and it's just not, you can't maintain this level. And so we need to get back down to more rational levels. I mean, fortunately, there's great ways to grow your business that are much, much more efficient. And so it doesn't need to be done this way. And I hate that these startups were given this bad advice, because these are people. I mean, I shared another post where the guy's just heartbroken over the fact that a startup failed, and he tried to follow the right advice. I mean, he mapped out, I'm following best practices, and I still didn't succeed. And so it's really important if you're a startup, that you focus on the actual correct advice. It's not just what you read on LinkedIn. I shared another piece of research that showed actually the worst run studies get the most references. And it's the same thing here. A lot of times you'll see things that get a ton of traffic, a ton of comments, a ton of likes, and it's the worst advice to follow. And so you really have to find trusted people who can show you how to grow effectively and efficiently if you're a startup. Because unfortunately, you say it's one thing to see sales and marketing costs, expense increase on a chart, but this is the reality of it. It's causing businesses to fail. So we need to get out of this. All right, finally, I want to wrap up with this post from Rick Bradberry. More highlights from my Forrester B2B Summit keynote last week. Beyond the breaking point, it's time for a revenue process transformation. Today's B2B buyers have more control in the purchase process. They use self-service tools and have low tolerance for invasive vendor practices that violate their professional space. And so I want to highlight that. They have more control and they have low tolerance for these practices. But the problem is, people need to make their numbers. And so they're doubling down on these invasive practices. They keep focusing on them, and that's not the way to do it. Ray's point here is contacts are real people. Leads are real people. Buying group members are real people. So treat them like real people. And so respect a prospect's time and goals, and then enable them to complete the buying task. And this is the most important thing. Help customers achieve value. When they achieve value, they progress, purchase, and expand faster and higher dollar amounts. And so I think this is a great point. I really want to highlight this, is that just because you want people to fall through the funnel, to move through the funnel to drive them to close one deal in a certain way, what we should really be doing is focusing on how we can support them through the buying process. And that's the critical point here. And I'm so glad that Rick brought this up. I'm interested to see what else he has to say about this.
3 tips for growing your business today. First up, if you're a small brand, don't necessarily emulate what big brands are doing. That could be bad advice for you. Those big brands didn't grow doing what they're doing today. They took a different approach when they're first starting up. And so make sure as a small brand, you're following good advice that applies to you. 2, it's a tough time out there for startups, but that doesn't mean it's hopeless. There's ways to drive growth efficiently, even though you've been given bad advice in terms of pursuing growth at all costs, wasting dollars. And then 3, Make sure that you treat people in the buying decision as people. Don't try to force them down through your funnel the way you want them to go. Think about how you can support them in making their buying decision. It'll be much more effective.